She answered a simple question in court. Then a white cop handcuffed her like a criminal. Moments later, her father walked in, a retired Navy SEAL. Silent, calm, but the whole room froze. What do you do when the very system that's meant to protect your child becomes the one that harms her? Have you ever seen justice turn its back in plain sight? Tell us what you would have done in that courtroom. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around, because what happened next, no one saw coming. The courthouse looked smaller than Layla expected. Not in size, there was plenty of space, but in air. It felt tight, like the walls were closing in, even though they hadn't sat down yet. She walked a step behind her mother, eyes cast down, her fingers nervously smoothing the hem of her blazer. The hallway smelled of old paper and lemon polish. Familiar to some, but not to her. This was Layla's first time in court. She wasn't the one being sued. Wasn't the defendant. Just a witness. A teenage girl there to speak on behalf of her mother's friend. A sweet old woman who'd been fighting her white neighbor over a small strip of land. The kind of land nobody ever notices until someone tries to take it. Layla knew what she had to say. She'd rehearsed it, kept her answers short and respectful, her voice steady. But as they entered the courtroom, the air shifted. Everyone was white. The judge, the bailiff, the lawyers, the clerk. Even the gallery benches were filled with unfamiliar white faces, mostly older, most watching the door when she walked in, then watching her a little too long when she didn't look away. Layla's mom gave her a gentle nudge and a whisper. "Head up, baby. You got this." So she did. She walked quietly to the second row, sat with her back straight, hands in her lap, and tried not to fidget. Her navy blue skirt brushed against the wooden bench, just like they'd practiced. Modest, professional, invisible if possible. But she wasn't invisible. Not to Officer Derek Wallace. He was leaning against the far wall, arms crossed tight, eyes scanning the room like he was looking for trouble before it started. And when his eyes met Layla's, they didn't leave. He stared not like someone noticing a new face, but like someone already suspicious of it. Layla glanced away, then back. Still staring. She wasn't doing anything wrong, just sitting, still. But that stare, it stripped her of stillness. She tried to smile, not big, just a nervous, polite lift of her lips as she turned to her mother beside her, who was whispering something under her breath, maybe going over testimony. Layla didn't catch it. She just smiled, half smile really, trying to breathe, trying to stay calm. And that's when Officer Wallace stepped forward. The courtroom had settled into a quiet rhythm. Papers shuffled, shoes scuffed softly against tile, voices stayed low. The judge barely looked up as the attorney for the defendant rose, smoothing his tie with a slow, practiced hand. He was tall, white, mid-50s. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried authority, like someone who was used to being agreed with. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Layla. "Miss Monroe," he began, polite smile curving at the corners. "You said you've seen the boundary line yourself?" Layla nodded. "Yes, sir, many times." "And in your opinion, does your mother's friend deserve to keep that strip of land?" Layla blinked. She hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the question felt loaded, like a trap dressed in manners. Before she could speak, he added, this time more casually, almost chuckling. "How much land do you think your kind should own, anyway?" The room didn't gasp. No one shouted. It was the kind of sentence that slips through the cracks in places like this. The kind that leaves just enough room for denial, but not enough for dignity. Layla didn't answer. Her eyes found her mother's. Mrs. Monroe's lips were tight. Her hands clutched the hem of her skirt, knuckles pale. Layla turned back to the attorney, then looked down. She shook her head softly and let out a breath, half sigh, half laugh. The kind you release when you've already heard too much for one day. And that's when he moved. Officer Wallace, heavy boots, quick steps. He walked toward Layla like he'd just spotted a threat. "Are you mocking this court?" Layla looked up, startled. "No, sir. You think this is funny?" She opened her mouth, closed it, then finally said, as calmly as she could, "I was just breathing, sir." Wallace turned to the judge. Contempt. Judge Sloan barely glanced up from her notes. "Proceed." Mrs. Monroe shot to her feet. "She didn't do anything." "Ma'am," the bailiff snapped. "Sit down." Wallace reached for his cuffs. Layla instinctively pulled her hands back, then froze. "No sudden moves," he warned, louder than necessary. Layla raised her arms slowly, her eyes wide but dry. There were no tears. Not yet. He cuffed her in front of the entire courtroom. The metal clicked once, then again. The room stayed silent. No outrage, no protest. Just the scrape of a chair leg somewhere in the back. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Soft, unremarkable. The kind of sound that gets lost in the hum of paperwork and low whispers. No one turned to look. No one had a reason to. But Marcus Monroe didn't need anyone's attention. He brought his own gravity with him. He stood just inside the threshold, not moving forward, not leaning back. A tall black man in a plain charcoal shirt, sleeves rolled up. Clean-shaven, quiet. His presence didn't announce itself. It settled like a storm front no one saw coming. His eyes went straight to her. Layla, his daughter. Wrists bound in metal, head low, trying not to look afraid, or maybe trying not to look for him. Marcus didn't blink. Not when he saw her hands cuffed. Not when he noticed the tension in her shoulders. Not when he registered the white officer gripping her arm just a little too tight. His fingers curled slowly into fists. Not in rage, but in restraint, like he'd trained himself for decades to hold the shot until it mattered. Behind him, the courtroom murmured, then stilled. No one knew who he was. Not yet. He took one step forward, just one. Then he spoke, voice low even. "Your Honor, I request 2 minutes to speak." The room tensed. Not out of fear, out of something quieter, the kind of tension that fills a space when someone enters who isn't afraid to be there. Judge Sloan glanced up. She squinted. "You are?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on Layla. His jaw clenched once, barely visible unless you were watching him closely. Then he turned slightly toward the bench. Just a father, watching his child get punished for breathing. Sloane's eyes narrowed. "Sir, this isn't the time." But someone else had already moved. One of the younger deputies standing by the gallery took a step back. His eyes had caught something on Marcus's forearm. A dark ink that curved up his skin, half covered by his rolled sleeve. The seal trident, faded but unmistakable. The deputy didn't say a word, just stepped aside. Marcus didn't push forward, didn't speak again. He'd said enough. Marcus didn't move fast. He never did. He reached slowly into his back pocket, like a man pulling out a folded receipt. Casual, unbothered, practiced. But when he brought his hand forward, it wasn't a receipt. It was a card. Dark blue. Laminated, edges worn from years of use. He held it between 2 fingers and stepped forward, laying it gently on the clerk's table, like it belonged there. Nobody breathed. The gold letters across the top caught the overhead light. Department of the Navy, SEAL Team 6, Chief Marcus D. Monroe, Ret. Silence rippled through the room. Officer Wallace, still gripping Layla's arm, blinked once, then twice, then stepped back as if the card had burned him. Behind him, another officer leaned closer, squinted, and whispered under his breath, "Holy hell, that's the guy from the Yemen op." The whisper wasn't loud, but it carried, like truth tends to. Judge Sloan leaned forward now, eyes narrowing, not out of confidence but calculation. She looked at the card, then at Marcus. "Is this supposed to intimidate the court?" Marcus met her gaze, calm as ever. "No, ma'am, I'm reminding it who it's hurting." He didn't raise his voice, he didn't even blink. But the weight of those words landed. Across the courtroom, Layla didn't move. She hadn't turned around, hadn't seen the card, hadn't heard the whisper about Yemen. But she felt it, something shift, like the current had changed. Still, she kept her eyes low, hands still cuffed, shoulders still small. Inside she was trying not to shake, not because she didn't feel safe, but because part of her still wondered if she deserved to. Because when you grow up being watched, always watched, you learn to wonder if the watching is your fault. And even with her father in the room, even with the air starting to turn, Layla still felt invisible. For a moment, everything held still. Judge Sloan looked up from her notes, her eyes slower now, more present. She adjusted her glasses, then glanced toward Layla. "Before I close this matter, Ms. Monroe, if you have anything to say, this is your chance." Layla blinked. She hadn't expected to be given the floor. Not after what had just happened. Not with the metal still cold against her wrists. She opened her mouth slightly, but nothing came out. Then she turned, just enough to see her father. Marcus stood beside her now, close but not too close. He didn't say a word, didn't push. He simply placed a steady hand on her shoulder, warm, firm, and nodded once. That was all. Layla closed her eyes, and in that dark behind her eyelids, memory surfaced. She was 8, A school classroom, a white teacher asking a black boy to read aloud, and when he stuttered, she sighed loud enough for the whole class to hear. Maybe books just aren't your thing. Layla had looked around. No one said anything. Neither did she. Even when the boy lowered his head and didn't speak for the rest of the year. She'd told herself it wasn't her place, that someone older would speak, that silence wasn't wrong, it was just safe. But silence hadn't saved him. And it hadn't saved her, either. Layla opened her eyes. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but clear. Silence doesn't protect you. She paused. It erases you. The words hung there, not loud, not angry, just honest. Judge Sloan didn't move. No one in the room did. And for the first time that day, Layla looked up. Not at the judge, not at the officer, but straight ahead. Like someone who knew her voice might still tremble, but it wouldn't disappear again. Silence. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that settles into the bones of a room after something sacred has been said. Layla stood still, her chest rising and falling in shallow waves. The words had left her lips barely a minute ago, but they still floated in the air, untouched. Silence doesn't protect you, it erases you. No one clapped, no one whispered, not even the scratch of a pen, just stillness. Until from the front of the room a small sound broke through. Not loud. Barely a sniffle. It came from the interpreter's table. A woman in her late 50s, silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She raised a trembling hand to her cheek, wiping a tear that had started its journey long before she realized it was falling. Her gaze wasn't on Layla. It was somewhere else, distant, buried. Like that sentence had awakened something old and unspoken in her, too. At the defense table, the opposing attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He cleared his throat once, then adjusted his cufflinks, though no one was looking. Near the door, Officer Wallace stood frozen in place, one hand still near the holster he hadn't touched. He didn't blink. For a moment, he just stared. Not at Layla, but at Marcus. Two men. Two soldiers, maybe. But only one had chosen the kind of battle that demanded silence, not noise. Wallace's jaw tightened, his shoulders twitched like he wanted to say something. But he didn't. He looked away. And that was enough. It wasn't surrender. But it wasn't defiance either. It was retreat. Quiet, unannounced. The first ripple of something shifting. At the bench, Judge Sloan finally exhaled. She hadn't noticed she'd been holding her breath. She leaned back in her chair, looked not at Layla nor Marcus, but at the middle of the room, like searching for something she didn't want to admit was missing. Her voice, when it came, was no longer clipped or tired. This court is adjourned, for now. There was no bang of the gavel, just her words, settling like dust. Marcus didn't move immediately. He waited, gave space for the moment to pass, for the weight of it to land where it needed. Then, with a quiet step forward, he came to Layla's side. Her shoulders were still drawn up, as if unsure whether she'd spoken too much or too late. He didn't say a word, just placed one hand on her back, gentle and grounding. She turned toward him slowly. Their eyes met for the first time since it all began. And there it was, what had been missing for so long. Not forgiveness, not apology, but recognition. Two souls that had wandered far apart, finding their way back without needing to speak it aloud. Marcus tilted his head just slightly. Layla nodded, and together they began to walk. No rush, no shame. The courtroom didn't erupt, no one stood to cheer, but heads turned, eyes followed, and not the way they had when she first walked in. Not with judgment, not with doubt, but with something quieter. Respect, maybe. Reflection. Like the room was still catching up to what had just happened. As they reached the doors, the same ones Marcus had stepped through not long ago, Layla hesitated. She turned her head just once to glance back. The bench, the witness chair, the judge's robe, still in place, still powerful, but somehow smaller now. Not because they'd changed, but because she had. And then, without a word, she turned again. Marcus held the door open. She stepped into the hallway, the light from the windows warming her skin. Not like a spotlight, but like morning after a long, cold night. Outside, the world still spun the same. But inside her, everything had moved. The gavel was back in its drawer. The courtroom lights dimmed one by one. But Judge Kimberly Sloan stayed seated long after the room had emptied. Not on the bench, not in front of anyone. In her chambers, alone. The walls were lined with books she hadn't opened in years. Not because she didn't care, but because, At some point, she stopped thinking she had time to read for the sake of remembering. She read for rulings, for precedent, for paperwork. Tonight, though, she didn't read. She opened a drawer, pulled out a worn manila folder from the back, one with a green sticker in the corner and her own handwriting in red ink across the top. D. Turner, minor. She knew the name before she saw it. David Turner, 17, black, accused of stealing a watch from a teacher's desk. No witnesses, just suspicion. 20 years ago, she'd fought tooth and nail to dismiss that case. She remembered sitting up all night, reviewing juvenile law, rereading the school's code of conduct, even calling the teacher in for a private meeting. If you can't prove it, you don't get to ruin a boy's life with it. She'd said that, out loud, to a room full of colleagues who had raised their eyebrows but ultimately backed down. David walked out of that courtroom with his record clean. She remembered the look in his mother's eyes, that mix of disbelief and relief, like someone had finally stopped the bleeding. That day, Sloan had driven home without the radio on. The silence had felt earned. Now she didn't even remember the last time she'd turned the radio off. She'd just gotten used to the noise. She looked up and caught her own reflection in the glass of a framed certificate. Not the official one, just the one her father gave her when she passed the bar. Keep your spine straight, even when it costs you. Her spine was still straight, but the fire that once lit her chest felt more like a flicker now. She stood, walked slowly to the mirror mounted above the coat hook. No makeup, lines deeper than they used to be. But that wasn't what caught her off guard. It was her eyes. How tired they looked. Not from work, but from the weight of going along. When did I stop fighting and start floating? She said it out loud, just to hear it, just to make it real. There was no answer, just the sound of the wall clock ticking behind her. Sloan turned back to her desk, pulled out a blank notepad, wrote, slowly and deliberately, in pen, request for internal review regarding conduct of Officer D. Wallace, filed by Presiding Judge Kimberly Sloan. She didn't write a long explanation, didn't try to soften it, just facts, just the truth. Because that's what had slipped too far from her hands lately. Not power, not authority, but honesty. She signed her name at the bottom, paused, then pressed the pen down a second time, hard enough to leave a dent beneath the ink. When she leaned back, the silence felt different than it had in years. Not heavy, not empty, just quiet. Like the first moment in a long time when the room wasn't deciding who she had become. She was. The sun had dipped low by the time they reached the curb. Not gone, not yet, but that late afternoon gold had begun to stretch shadows across the sidewalk like soft fingers reaching for one more moment of daylight. Marcus walked beside Layla, not ahead, not behind, just next to her. Their steps matched in rhythm, not perfect, not practiced, just natural. Like maybe they'd done this once a long time ago. Neither spoke. There was no need to. The courthouse was behind them now, its stone columns growing smaller with each step, its coldness slowly peeling off their shoulders. Ahead, the yellow school bus sat humming by the curb, half full of kids with backpacks too big and voices too loud. The driver leaned on the steering wheel, eyes watching the clock, but not in a hurry. Layla slowed her pace as they neared. Her fingers gripped the straps of her backpack tighter, then loosened. She looked up at Marcus, her expression unreadable. Somewhere between disbelief and something softer. He turned to face her fully. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, almost like it surprised him too, proud of you, kid. No flourish, no speech, just those 5 words. Layla blinked. She'd been called smart, strong, quiet, but never that. Not by him. She nodded, but her voice was quiet. You coming home tonight? Marcus tilted his head, just slightly. His eyes didn't dart, they held. I'll be home before dark. A pause. Not dramatic, just honest. Like a man saying it because he meant it this time. Layla gave a half smile. The kind that only shows up when you're not sure if you're about to cry or laugh, so you do neither. Then, almost out of instinct, she stepped closer, and he opened his arms. Not wide, not urgent. Just enough. She walked into them like she'd done it 1,000 times before, even if she hadn't in years. His arms closed around her. Slow, sure, steady. And for a moment, the world outside went quiet. The sound of traffic dimmed. The kids on the bus faded into a blur. It was like the city had stopped moving just long enough to let a father and daughter feel something that had been waiting too long in silence. No one said anything, and that somehow made it louder. Marcus didn't squeeze. He just held her like she was something he'd carried through a battlefield without ever knowing he could lose. And Layla didn't cry. Not because she didn't want to, but because there was nothing left to prove. The door of the bus creaked open. The driver glanced over, gave a nod, a silent way of saying, "Take your time." Layla pulled back just a little. Looked up. Marcus brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, then stepped back. "Go on," he said. "I'll be home before dark." She nodded again, more certain this time. Stepped onto the bus, found a seat by the window. As the engine rumbled and the bus began to pull away, she looked out. Marcus was still standing there. Hands in his pockets, eyes steady. He didn't wave. She didn't either. They didn't have to, because for the first time in a very long time, they both knew exactly where the other would be when the sun went down. The photo ran above the fold. It wasn't dramatic. No gavel midair. No officer in cuffs. Just a still frame of a girl standing at the witness stand, hands clasped in front of her, chin lifted ever so slightly. The headline read, "The Girl Who Stood Still and Moved the Room." It was the Thursday edition of the East Side Herald, a small local paper known more for sports scores and weekend bake sales than courthouse stories. But this one made the front page. No one had expected it to. Not even the reporter, who had been covering the zoning dispute like it was just another neighborly scuffle over grass lines and property stakes. He hadn't expected that hearing to end with a teenager's quiet words freezing a room full of adults. He hadn't expected the silence that followed, or the ripple that came after. The article didn't mention names, not officially. The photo didn't need a caption. People recognized her. That girl with the navy skirt and two small shoes, the one who didn't shout, the one who stood still. A week later, the courthouse hallways smelled of floor wax and copier ink, just like always. The echo of heels and Oxfords bounced against the marble floors, interrupted only by the occasional buzz of a vending machine or the soft knock of a gavel down the corridor. By mid-morning, a new display had been mounted along the eastern wall, a rotating series of images from local civic life. School events, charity drives, public town hall meetings. And now, this photo. Layla Monroe, 17, standing silent, frozen in a frame that somehow said everything. The light from the skylight above caught her face just right. Not polished, not poised, but steady. Like someone who had learned how not to flinch. People stopped as they passed. Some just glanced. Some lingered a second longer. A few took out their phones and snapped a quick picture, then walked on. But one boy, small, no older than 9, stood perfectly still in front of it. He was dressed in a faded hoodie 2 sizes too big, with cartoon stickers peeling off the corners of his backpack. His sneakers had grass stains, and his laces were tucked inside instead of tied. He stared at the photo for a long time. His mother stood nearby, digging through her purse for paperwork, then checking the number on their court slip. "Mom," he said finally without turning. She looked up. "Yeah, baby?" Still staring at the picture. "Can I speak up too?" She froze for a second, then stepped closer. Her hand came to rest on his shoulder, not heavy, not guiding. Just there. She looked at the photo again, then down at him. "You already are." They didn't stay long. The boy walked with her down the hallway, his small hand wrapped around 2 fingers of hers. He didn't look back, but the photograph stayed behind. Framed, lit from above, quiet, still. It didn't demand attention, it didn't ask for applause. It just existed. The way truth does, the way dignity does, the way some stories once whispered, refuse to be unheard. If this story moved you, even just a little, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that speak softly, but stay loud in your heart. Your support means everything. It's what keeps our team going and helps us bring more truth, hope, and human dignity to life, one voice at a time.